Obviously, the South African urban transition is at a very different point to India's. This is just, from census data since 1920, when the first census was conducted. You'll see there that already since the mid-1970s, we've already gone past the 50% mark, and that urban areas are just growing a lot faster than rural areas. But what is important to understand within this, of course, is that in the imaginary of the apartheid state, black people were not meant to be in cities and towns. They were meant to be in certain enclaves. And so there was always a depressive set of policies to try and stem urbanization. We don't, obviously, since the next census is next year, we're not sure what this number is, and as I'll indicate you a bit later, we've got some weird anomalies as well, because part of the apartheid policy was to designate certain areas rural, but they concentrated large number of black surplus labor pools in those areas. So they were effectively urban, but they're still designated as rural. What is important about this distribution is the intense sort of red marks, those intense red concentrations, which is a direct product of this Bantustan policy. So essentially, in the imaginary of the apartheid state, all tribal black people, that each tribal group had to have their own kind of homeland, or what we called Bantustans, and that has left a profound mark on the spatial structure of South Africa, which we're really grappling with. To give you some sense of what's been happening in the last decade, so what this map indicates is population growth and migration. So the green bars are natural growth, the red bars is growth through migration, and then the blue bars combined growth. Okay, and what you clearly see from this is that in the coastal provinces on this side, there's basically a loss of population, and in Gauteng, in Johannesburg, where those higher bars are, and in Cape Town, there's a massive attraction of population. If we then look at absolute change in GDP, what you see is that the economy of the country is basically anchored in the three metropolitan regions of South Africa. Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg are basically the three places that is carrying the entire economy. If you then also look at employment creation, what is interesting is that in Cape Town's case, there's hardly any growth, even though it is a significant contributor to economic growth. So Cape Town, in a way, has jobless growth, whereas Johannesburg is clearly the center of employment. The yellow bits, though, are the real legacy of apartheid. So the yellow bits represent the former Bantustans. These are effectively rural areas. There's no economic base. But you've got almost 12 million people out of a population of 50 million people that's there, and there's zero economic base to support it. 4% of the total value added in the economy is located in those areas. And that's really one of the big drivers of the contemporary obsession within the ruling party around dealing with rural poverty as the solution to the broader developmental question in South Africa. Now, just to really bed this down and concretize why we're having a real hard time in the country to have a meaningful and a focused and a clear discussion about this. What you see from this graph is that the majority of households sit in the metropolitan areas and the secondary cities. But if you look at the population proportions, you're going to see that there's also a very large number of very poor people who live in these areas. However, we've got a very large number of people who are still in these former Bantustan areas as well. The incomes that you see here is essentially from the government's welfare policies. Okay, so it's pensions and it is remittances from family members outside, and then a very small proportion of people that actually work. And this then is just confirmed if you do other kind of economic splices. So as you can see, services dominate in the urban areas, unsurprisingly, and of course mining and agriculture more important, and significant is mining in the secondary cities. And if you look at employment by region, what is significant about this is how relatively small the informal component is. Okay, so South Africa has got a unique feature in that it's got mass unemployment and it's got a small informal sector. So this then is the scale of the problem that we're trying to grapple with. 63% of all households live on less than, in South African rands, 1,500 rand per month. And if you take the number up to 3,500 rand, you're talking, which is the benchmark for the public housing program, you're talking about 80% of the population. Okay, it's really dramatic. That also means, of course, that in terms of how the public housing program has been designed, 80% of the population is eligible. Okay, and you'll see later on the kind of problems that creates. this is just to give you some sense of the growth of household informalization then. So the total number of informal dwellings from the 2007 survey puts the number at 1.8 million households. Now, to sort of give you a more sort of grounded material sense of this, I just want to go through a couple of slides that explores these dynamics and their contemporary manifestation in Cape Town, which is where I live. So that's Table Mountain, it faces that way, but the ridge actually goes all the way down the peninsula. The majority of Cape Townians live here on what we call the Cape Flats. So this is the zone of exclusion in the city. This is where the wealthy lives, nestled either on the foothill of the mountains on this side, and if you are really wealthy, you are nestled between the ocean and the mountains, of course. And then another sort of colonial idiosyncrasy of Cape Town is that if you're white and you speak English, you live on this side. If you're white and you speak Afrikaans, you live on this axis, on that side. This is the physical footprint, the built environment footprint in 1985. So just to give you some sense of, so before the fall of apartheid, but some relaxation of influx control and migration to the city. And it grows by 40% in 20 years to 2005. Okay. Now, what's significant about all this growth is that this is where the poor are then concentrated, so all the growth, and this is where the wealthy moves to, is the northern parts of the city. So what you have is a further splitting apart of basically income and racial groups through this particular built form. This is the zone of deep exclusion in the city, so in the sort of bizarre apartheid sort of hierarchy of privilege or exclusion, what we in our parlance call black African people in South Africa, are really sort of excluded as far away from the economic backbone of the city on the edge here. This is the urban edge. And then the sort of colored working class communities are sort of in the adjacent area. And then colored middle class is on that particular buffer. And then this is mainly white. And of course, it's slowly deracializing in terms of the sort of black middle class, but it's still marginal in terms of the overall number. So one of the key things to sort of get about the South African story is that it's not a narrative about disinvestment or about state withdrawal. There's been a massive redistributive effort, but the cumulative effect of that has hardly made any difference in the spatial structure of our urban fabric.